What if everything you believed about justice was a lie? What if the people society swore to protect the most, children, the innocent, the vulnerable, became pawns in a brutal system that demanded quick answers instead of the truth? In 1984, two brothers from a small North Carolina town were dragged into a nightmare that would last 3 long decades. Their names? Henry Lee McCollum and Leon Brown. And here's the haunting part. Their so-called confessions didn't come from evidence, didn't come from truth. They came from fear, fear planted in two young minds who had no way to fight back. Before we dive deeper, ask yourself, how many people are still sitting in cells right now, whispering the same words Henry and Leon cried for years? I didn't do it? If that thought makes your stomach turn, stay with me, because this story is going to change the way you see justice forever. Let's set the stage. Red Springs, North Carolina, a small rural town in the early 1980s, the kind of place where everybody claimed to know each other, where the rhythm of life was slow, steady, and predictable, until it wasn't. On the evening of September 24th, 1983, the unthinkable happened. The body of 11-year-old Sabrina Bowie was discovered in a soybean field. It was brutal, traumatic, a crime that shook not just the town, but the entire state. The community was in shock. Parents clutched their children tighter, and whispers spread like wildfire. Who could have done this? Police were under immense pressure. Solve the case fast, calm the outrage, restore the illusion of safety. And when pressure mixes with desperation, that's when shortcuts are taken. That's when innocence is destroyed. Henry Lee McCollum was just 19 years old at the time. His younger half-brother, Leon Brown, only 15. Both had intellectual disabilities, both were vulnerable, and both, unfortunately, were perfect targets for investigators who needed someone, anyone, to blame. The boys were picked up and interrogated for hours. Imagine being a teenager, barely understanding the questions, with adults towering over you, repeating accusations you don't understand. The police wanted confessions, not truth. And eventually, after endless pressure, Henry and Leon broke. They signed statements they didn't even fully comprehend. Words placed in front of them by the very people who were supposed to protect them. It was a script, a fiction. But once signed, it became the state's golden ticket to closure. Now pause and imagine this. What if it was your brother, your cousin, or your son, terrified, confused, cornered into saying things he didn't mean? And suddenly the rest of his life was decided by that single moment. That fear, that helplessness, is exactly what Henry and Leon lived with. The town wanted justice. Prosecutors wanted convictions. And in 1984, that's exactly what they got. Henry Lee McCollum was sentenced to death. Death. A teenager with the mental capacity of a child, now condemned to wait for the state to take his life. Leon Brown, life in prison without parole. Two boys labeled monsters overnight, their lives stolen before they even had the chance to begin. For the next 3 decades, the brothers lived inside the concrete walls of North Carolina's prison system. Henry sat on death row, years and years of staring at the clock, wondering if each tick brought him closer to the end. Leon suffered silently too, often targeted by other inmates, enduring physical and psychological torment. And the entire time, both kept saying the same thing. We didn't do it. But who was listening? Almost no one. For the state, the case was closed. For the community, the monsters had been caught. Meanwhile, the real killer walked free. Here's the truth that should haunt every one of us. While Henry and Leon were trapped in a cage, the real predator lived outside those bars, breathing the same free air as everyone else. How many more crimes were committed because no one stopped him? And that's where this story takes a devastating turn. Because only decades later, with new evidence and the power of DNA testing, would the truth finally come crashing into the open. But by then, the damage was already done. This is not just the story of two men wrongfully convicted. This is the story of how an entire system, from police to prosecutors to jurors, conspired, intentionally or not, to steal 30 years of freedom from two innocent brothers. And as you'll soon see, when the truth finally emerged in 2014, the world wasn't just shocked. It was forced to confront one of the darkest stains on American justice. I remember the room being cold. Not the kind of cold you feel outside on a winter night, but the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you shiver even when you don't want to. They kept asking me the same things over and over. You were there, weren't you, Henry? You saw what happened. I shook my head. I told them no, but they didn't stop. Hours passed. I was 19, but in my mind, I wasn't much older than a boy. I wanted my mama. I wanted somebody to tell me it was going to be okay. Instead, they told me lies. They said Leon already confessed. They said if I just signed, I could go home. When you've been sitting in that room for hours, when you're scared and tired, and grown men are shouting that you'll never leave unless you do what they say, you sign, even if you don't understand what's on the paper. I was 15, just a kid. They told me the same thing. Your brother said you did it. I didn't understand what they wanted. All I knew was that I couldn't think straight. So I signed too. I thought it would end, but it didn't. That's when it began. They told the court I confessed, but it wasn't my words. It was theirs. I tried to tell people I didn't mean it, that I was scared, but no one wanted to hear that. When the judge said death sentence, it felt like the floor disappeared under me. My mama cried so hard I couldn't look at her. I just kept thinking, I'm gonna die for something I didn't do. I'll never forget the day they took them away. Henry and Leon's sister said years later, we kept telling people they didn't do this, but nobody listened to us. Nobody cared about what we knew. They already had their story. A local reporter who covered the case admitted later, at the time, everyone just believed the police. These were young black men with intellectual disabilities. People in town said, it makes sense, doesn't it? It was easier for the community to believe the brothers were guilty than to face the possibility that the real killer was still out there. An attorney who would later fight for their release recalled looking at the original trial transcript. The so-called confessions made no sense. There were factual errors, things that didn't even line up with the crime scene. It was obvious these boys had been led into saying what the police wanted, but once you're convicted, the system makes it almost impossible to undo. Neighbors remembered how the case divided the town. On one side, you had people who were convinced Henry and Leon were monsters. On the other, folks who quietly wondered if the boys really understood what they had signed. But fear ruled everything. People wanted to feel safe again, and believing the police gave them that. For years, the voices of Henry and Leon were drowned out by the machinery of the justice system. Their families' pleas were ignored, reporters moved on, and the lawyers who might have helped them didn't come into the picture until decades later. This wasn't just two men against the law. This was two men against silence, against indifference, against time itself. And what's most chilling, while Henry sat on death row and Leon wasted away in prison, the real killer, a man named Roscoe Artis, lived right there in the same town, free to harm again. It would take nearly 30 years, new technology, and relentless persistence before DNA evidence finally shattered the state's story. But for Henry and Leon, 30 years is a lifetime. The first night on death row, I couldn't sleep. I lay on that hard bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of metal doors clanging shut. Every noise echoed. Every footstep outside my cell made my chest tighten. I kept asking myself the same question. How can I be here? How can I be sentenced to die for something I didn't do? Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. The guards treated me like I was already guilty, already a killer. They looked at me like I was less than human. I learned quickly that on death row, Time is the cruelest punishment. You don't just count days, you count the seconds between each heartbeat, wondering if the next one will be your last. Sometimes I would hear men crying in their cells at night. Other times I'd hear prayers whispered so soft, like they didn't even want God to hear. And then, sometimes I'd hear silence after an execution day, silence that felt heavier than the sound of chains. Prison life wasn't just bars and concrete. It was danger. It was fear. I was only 15 when they locked me up, and I didn't understand the rules. I didn't understand the gangs, the codes, the way you had to walk with your head down, but never look too weak. Older men targeted me. I was bullied, beaten, and worse. I kept thinking about my mama, about my sisters, about the life I would never get back. I was just a boy. But in there, they didn't care if you were a boy or a man. You were just prey. The nights were the hardest. I would close my eyes and try to imagine home. The sound of cicadas outside, the smell of my mama's cooking. But every time I opened them, all I saw were gray walls and razor wire. They said I'd never get out. Never. That word, never, burned into my mind like a brand you can't wash away. I started writing letters to anyone, to lawyers, to newspapers, to people I thought might listen. Most of them never answered. Some came back unopened, but writing was the only thing that kept me alive. I told them the same thing every time. I didn't do it. Please, somebody, believe me. Years passed. I saw men come and go. Some were taken to the chamber. Others gave up hope and stopped fighting, but I couldn't. Even if nobody heard me, I had to keep saying it. I didn't do it. Prison changed me in ways I can't explain. I became quiet, withdrawn. The walls pressed in closer every year. I stopped trusting people, stopped talking much at all. Sometimes I would sit on my bunk and wonder if maybe this was my life forever, that the truth would never matter, that I'd grow old behind bars and die there, still screaming a truth nobody wanted to hear. For Henry and Leon, prison wasn't just punishment. It was a slow erasure of who they were. Two boys who entered the system as teenagers were forced to become men in cages, their innocence buried beneath years of fear, abuse, and silence. But even in the darkest places, the smallest flicker of hope can survive. And that flicker would come decades later, when a lawyer's persistence and the quiet power of DNA would finally open the door to the truth. By the early 2000s, Henry and Leon had already spent nearly 2 decades behind bars. Their appeals had been denied repeatedly. Courts upheld the convictions, citing the confessions as solid evidence. For most people, the case was closed, but not for the lawyers at the North Carolina Innocence Inquiry Commission, a state agency created to investigate claims of wrongful conviction. In 2009, Henry's lawyers petitioned the commission to review his case. At the heart of the request was one simple fact: no physical evidence had ever tied either brother to the crime. Everything hinged on those shaky, coerced confessions. The commission agreed to re-examine the case. Their team pulled evidence from storage boxes that hadn't been touched in decades: cigarette butts, beer cans, and other items collected from the crime scene in 1983. And then came the moment that would change everything: modern DNA testing. The results were undeniable. The DNA didn't match Henry. It didn't match Leon. Instead, it matched a man named Roscoe Artis, a convicted rapist and murderer who, at the time of Sabrina Bouie's killing, lived just feet away from the soybean field where her body was found. Artis was already serving a life sentence for another murder eerily similar in nature. The evidence that tied him to Sabrina's case was overwhelming. Armed with the new DNA findings, defense lawyers filed motions demanding Henry and Leon's release. The state pushed back. Prosecutors argued that the confession still held weight, despite being proven unreliable. But in September 2014, the truth could no longer be ignored. Judge Douglas Sasser vacated the convictions, stating, The evidence is clear. These men are innocent. After 30 years in prison, Henry Lee McCollum and Leon Brown were finally free. News cameras captured the moment. Henry walked out first, his hands raised, tears streaming down his face. Leon followed, quiet and shaken. Family members hugged them, sobbing, their lives forever marked by decades of absence. For Henry, it had been 3 decades on death row. For Leon, 3 decades of a life sentence. Both were taken as teenagers and released as middle-aged men, their youth stolen by a system that failed them. The case of Henry and Leon became one of the most glaring examples of wrongful conviction in American history. It revealed the dangers of coerced confessions, especially from vulnerable suspects with intellectual disabilities. It also raised haunting questions. Why wasn't Roscoe Artis investigated more thoroughly in 1983? How many other men and women have been silenced by confessions that were never truly theirs? And how many decades of life have been erased, never to be restored? Henry Lee McCollum and Leon Brown were declared innocent in 2014, but innocence doesn't erase the scars of 30 lost years. Their story is not just about justice delayed, it's about justice denied. A reminder that the system can make mistakes so catastrophic that no apology, no compensation, and no court ruling can ever give back what was taken. After their release in 2014, Henry Lee McCollum and Leon Brown stepped into a world that had moved on without them. Technology had transformed everyday life. Cell phones, the internet, social media, all things they had never known before. For 2 men who entered prison as teenagers, freedom felt almost alien. Both brothers struggled to adjust. Leon, in particular, battled severe mental health challenges after decades of trauma. Years of abuse in prison left deep scars, making it nearly impossible for him to live independently. Legal battles continued. In 2015, Henry and Leon filed lawsuits against law enforcement officials and the state of North Carolina. After years of litigation, juries awarded them millions in compensation for wrongful imprisonment, $75 million in damages. The state also paid a settlement, but money cannot buy back 30 years. It cannot restore stolen birthdays, missed family milestones, or the chance to live a normal life. When I walked out of those gates, I thought it was going to feel like a dream come true. And it did for a moment, but then I realized I didn't know how to live out here anymore. Everything was different. I lost my youth. I lost my mama while I was locked up. There were days I'd wake up free, but inside, I still felt like I was on death row. People tell me I'm strong, but strength don't come from wanting it. Strength comes from surviving what you shouldn't have had to survive. They took my life away before it even started. When you go in at 15 and come out 30 years later, you don't know how to be a man. You don't know how to be free. I have good days. I have bad days. Sometimes I just sit quiet and think about all the time I'll never get back. But I thank God every day I'm not behind those bars no more. Even with the pain, freedom is still better than the cage. Their case is now cited in legal textbooks, documentaries, and criminal justice reform debates. It exposed the deep flaws of relying on confessions extracted under duress. But for every Henry and Leon who walk free, how many others remain unheard? How many still sit in cells, innocent but forgotten? The story of Henry Lee McCollum and Leon Brown is not just about 2 men. It's about a system that demands accountability, a reminder that justice delayed is justice denied. And as you reflect on their stolen years, ask yourself, what is the true cost of a wrongful conviction? It's not just time, it's lives, it's families, it's humanity itself. 30 years in prison, 30 years of innocence buried under lies. And when the truth finally came, it didn't bring celebration, it brought mourning for all that was lost. Their names will never be forgotten. Henry Lee McCollum, Leon Brown, the brothers who survived the system that tried to erase them. Before we end, I want to ask you something. How many more Henrys and Leons are still out there, trapped behind bars for crimes they didn't commit? If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever seen or heard of similar cases where justice came far too late? Your voice matters, because the more we talk about these stories, the harder it becomes for the system to ignore them. Don't forget to like this video if you believe more people need to hear the truth about wrongful convictions. And if you want to uncover more stories like this, real cases, real lives, real consequences, hit subscribe and join us as we continue shining light into the darkest corners of the justice system. Together, maybe we can make sure that no one else loses 30 years of their life to a crime they never committed.